Hey folks, Night Owl, welcome back. Or if this is your first time here, well, you've picked a good one. Tonight's not about dragons or made-up kingdoms. Tonight's about something arguably weirder, actual history, real people, real ambition, real consequences. Blood doesn't make you royal. Sometimes it's just ambition, a sharp mind, and knowing exactly when to smile at the right powerful person. Tonight, we're diving into the story of a man who walked into Rome as a complete nobody and somehow convinced an entire kingdom to hand him a crown. No army, no birthright, just pure, unfiltered audacity. So, go ahead, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe pull that blanket a little higher, because we're about to drift back 26 centuries to a Rome that barely existed yet. A Rome where kings still ruled, where omens mattered more than votes, and where one very clever immigrant pulled off the most outrageous social climb in ancient history. So, let's talk about Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, or as he was known before he got fancy, Lucomo. Just Lucomo. One name, like Cher, but with fewer sequins and considerably more political scheming. Our boy Lucomo was born sometime around 650 BCE in a city called Tarquini. That's in Etruria, modern-day Tuscany if you're the type who daydreams about Italian vacations. Beautiful place. Rolling hills, olive groves, wine that'll make you weep. But here's the thing about Etruria. It wasn't Rome, and in the 7th century BCE, if you weren't Roman, you were basically nobody to the Romans. Now, Lucomo had a bit of a complicated family situation. His father was a Greek refugee named Demaratus. Demaratus had fled from Corinth, one of those classic, the tyrant wants to kill me so I'm relocating to Italy situations that were surprisingly common back then. Demaratus was wealthy, cultured, probably had great hair, and he'd managed to build a comfortable life in Tarquini. He married a local Etruscan woman, they had kids. Lucomo was one of them. So Lucomo grew up rich, educated, privileged. He had access to Greek culture, Etruscan traditions, all the benefits of a cosmopolitan upbringing. He definitely had expensive taste in, well, everything. But there was one tiny problem that would haunt him his entire youth. Etruria didn't care. See, Etruscan society had rules, rigid ones. Lucono's dad might have had money, but he was still a foreign refugee. And in Etruria, if your father wasn't born Etruscan nobility, you could have all the gold in the Mediterranean and it wouldn't matter. You'd never hold office, never have real political power. You'd forever be the rich kid that the old families tolerated at parties but never truly accepted. Lucomo felt it, every slight, every condescending smile from some blue blood whose ancestors had been feudal lords when Lucomo's dad was still dodging assassins in Greece. It ate at him, this sense that he was destined for more, but the world around him had already decided his ceiling. And then his father died. Demaratus left behind a fortune. Lucomo inherited wealth that most people in the ancient world couldn't even imagine. He had estates, luxury goods, connections, everything except the one thing he actually wanted, respect. Around this time, Lucomo married a woman named Tanaquil. And oh, we need to talk about Tanaquil, because she might be the most important person in this entire story. Tanaquil was Etruscan nobility, legitimate old blood aristocracy. But she had the same problem Lucomo did. She was smart, ambitious, and deeply aware that Etruria wasn't going to let either of them rise as far as they deserved. So one night, she said something that would change history. Let's leave. Not as refugees, not as failures, as pioneers, as people who would find a place that valued talent over bloodlines, ambition over ancestry. Where? Lucumo probably asked. Tanaquil smiled. Rome. Now, let's pause here, because you need to understand what Rome was in 650 BCE. It was not the marble-columned empire of the movies. It was not the mighty military machine that would eventually conquer the known world. Rome at this point was barely more than a collection of villages on some hills next to a river. It had a king, a guy named Ancus Marcius at the time, and it had walls, and it had ambition, but it was small, dusty, unsophisticated. It was also exactly the kind of place that a clever, wealthy, charismatic outsider might actually have a shot. So Lucumo and Tanaquil packed up everything they owned. They loaded their wealth onto carts, gathered their household slaves and attendants, and set off on the road south towards Rome. It must have been quite a caravan. Gold, furniture, fine fabrics, all the trappings of serious money rolling slowly through the Italian countryside. And then something weird happened. They were getting close to Rome, close enough to see the city on the horizon, and an eagle appeared, just swooped down out of nowhere. This massive bird circled above their caravan, then dove straight at Lucumo. It snatched the cap right off his head, flew up into the sky with it, circled again, and then placed it back on Lucumo's head. Now, if this happened to you, you'd probably freak out, maybe check for rabies, wonder if you'd been drugged. But Tanaquil went absolutely still. Her eyes went wide, because Tanaquil, like most educated Etruscans, knew how to read omens. Divination was basically a science to the Etruscans. They studied bird flight, lightning patterns, animal behavior, anything that might contain a message from the gods. And this was about as clear as omens got. Tanaquil turned to her husband, and according to the ancient historian Livy, she threw her arms around his neck and told him that he was destined for greatness. That eagle was Jupiter himself, king of the gods, marking Lucumo as someone chosen for supreme power. The cap being removed and replaced, that meant his old identity would be stripped away, and a new, royal one would take its place. Lucumo probably thought his wife had lost her mind, but Tanaquil was insistent. She told him to dream bigger, to stop thinking of himself as an Etruscan immigrant and start seeing himself as a future king. And here's the wild part. She was right. They entered Rome, this dusty, ambitious little city full of Latin farmers and petty nobles, and Lucumo, who somewhere along the way started calling himself Lucius Tarquinius, taking a properly Roman name. He didn't sneak in quietly. He didn't try to blend in. He rolled in like he owned the place. He immediately started making friends, not with merchants or other immigrants. No, Lucius went straight for the top. He threw lavish parties, he gave gifts, he offered his wealth and his counsel freely. He made himself useful, charming, indispensable. And he got noticed by the one person who mattered most, King Ancus Marcius himself. Ancus was impressed. Here was this sophisticated, educated, obviously wealthy Etruscan who spoke beautiful Latin, understood both Greek and Etruscan culture, and seemed genuinely invested in Rome's success. Lucius offered advice on building projects. He helped fund public works. He made himself the king's trusted friend. So trusted, in fact, that when Ancus Marcius died, he named Lucius Tarquinius as guardian of his two young sons. Let that sink in. The king of Rome put a foreign immigrant, a man who'd been in the city maybe 15, 20 years, in charge of his children, and by extension, in charge of managing the transition of power. Now, according to tradition, Rome's kingship wasn't strictly hereditary. Kings were elected by the people and confirmed by the Senate. But obviously, the sons of the previous king had a pretty strong claim. Everyone expected one of Ancus's boys to take the throne once they came to age, except Lucius Tarquinius, because Lucius had spent 20 years in Rome learning exactly how this place worked. He understood the tribes, the voting blocks, the families that held real influence. He'd built relationships, called in favors, positioned himself as the only logical choice to provide stable leadership. And when the time came to elect a new king, Lucius didn't defer to his wards. He didn't step aside for Ancus's sons. He put himself forward as a candidate. The audacity of it probably made half of Rome gasp. This immigrant, this outsider, this man who'd been nobody in his own homeland was now standing before the Roman people and saying, in effect, "I should be your king." And they believed him. The Roman people voted, the Senate confirmed it, and just like that, Lucamo, the boy from Tarquini who'd grown up knowing he'd never amount to anything in Etruria, became Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the 5th king of Rome. An immigrant king, a self-made monarch, a man who'd literally walked into a foreign city with nothing but money and ambition and talked his way onto a throne. Ancus Marcius's sons were, well, they were furious, betrayed, robbed of their birthright by the very man who was supposed to protect their interests. But they were also still young, and Lucius was now king, backed by the Roman people and the full power of the state. So they waited and watched and quietly nursed their grudges. But we'll get to that later, because Lucius Tarquinius Priscus didn't become king just to sit on a throne and look important. Oh no, this man had plans, big plans, plans that would transform Rome from a dusty hill town into something that looked like an actual city. He was going to build, he was going to conquer, he was going to drag Rome kicking and screaming into relevance. And for a while, impossibly, he was going to succeed. But that's where things get complicated, because here's the thing about building an empire on ambition and cleverness alone. Eventually, someone else comes along who's just as ambitious, just as clever, and sometimes that someone else is your own son-in-law. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's float forward to what Lucius actually did once he had that crown on his head, the crown that an eagle had basically promised him all those years ago on the road to Rome. Spoiler, he earned it, at least at first. So here's a fun fact about ancient kingship. Most kings, once they got the crown, basically just sat around looking regal while other people did the actual work. They'd show up for ceremonies, make sacrifices to the gods, occasionally declare war when they were bored, and generally treat the position like a very expensive retirement package. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was not that kind of king. This man woke up every morning like he still had something to prove, which, to be fair, he absolutely did. He was an immigrant who'd essentially conned his way onto a throne. Half of Rome probably still whispered about him at parties. The old patrician families, the ones with ancestry going back to Romulus himself, they tolerated him, but they didn't love him. Lucius knew this, and his solution was simple. Make yourself so valuable, so impressive, so obviously the right choice that nobody can question your legitimacy anymore. So he built stuff, a lot of stuff. First project? The Circus Maximus. Yes, that Circus Maximus. The enormous chariot racing stadium that would eventually hold 250,000 screaming Romans. Now, in Lucius's time, it wasn't the marble monument it would later become, but he's the one who laid it out. who chose the location in the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills, who organized the first formal races there. Why? Because Romans loved two things: violence and entertainment, and chariot racing provided both. Four-horse teams thundering around a track, drivers whipping their animals to the edge of collapse, crashes that sent men and horses tumbling in spectacular wrecks. It was Formula One meets gladiatorial combat. The people loved it, and they loved the king who gave it to them. But Lucius wasn't just pandering with entertainment. He understood that Rome needed infrastructure, real, practical, civilization-level infrastructure, the kind of thing that separates a collection of huts from an actual city. So he built the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer. Now, I know what you're thinking. A sewer, how exciting. But hear me out. The Cloaca Maxima was an engineering marvel. It was a massive drainage system that channeled all the water and waste from Rome's 7 hills down into the Tiber River. It drained the marshy land in the valley, making huge areas of the city habitable for the first time. Parts of that original sewer system still exist today, 2,600 years later, still functioning. Lucius also transformed the Forum Romanum, the Roman Forum. Before him, it was basically a swampy marketplace where people traded goods and occasionally held public meetings. Lucius drained it, paved it, turned it into the actual heart of Roman political and commercial life. He built shops, temples, public buildings. He created the space where Roman civilization would conduct its business for the next 1,000 years. He expanded the Senate, adding 100 new members. This was politically brilliant. By expanding the Senate, he brought in new families, new blood, people who owed their position to him rather than to centuries of tradition. He was building his own power base while appearing to be inclusive and democratic. And then there were the wars, because this is still ancient Rome, and no matter how much building you did, you weren't a legitimate king unless you could lead men into battle and come back with loot and glory. Lucius fought the Latins, the tribes that surrounded Rome. He fought the Sabines. He laid siege to cities, negotiated treaties, expanded Rome's territory and influence. He wasn't necessarily a military genius, but he was competent, and more importantly, he was successful. He won more often than he lost. He brought home spoils. He increased Rome's prestige. Under his rule, Rome grew, actually grew. The population increased. Wealth poured in. The city that had been a dusty backwater was starting to look like it might actually matter someday. But here's where things get messy, because Lucius had a family, and families in royal households are where the drama lives. Lucius and Tanaquil had 2 sons. We don't know much about them. History barely mentions them, which is weird, right? You'd think the sons of a king would be important, but they fade into obscurity, unnamed and powerless. Instead, the royal succession gets complicated because Lucius also had 2 daughters, and daughters in ancient royal families were political assets, marriage tools, ways to forge alliances or consolidate power. One of these daughters married a young man named Servius Tullius. Now, Servius is another fascinating character. According to legend, he was the son of a captured slave woman. He was born into the royal household, raised alongside Lucius's children, educated and trained as if he were nobility himself. Lucius took a special interest in him, saw something in the boy, potential, intelligence, that same hungry ambition that Lucius himself had brought from Etruria. So Lucius married Servius to his daughter, effectively adopting him into the royal family. Why? Maybe Lucius genuinely loved the young man like a son. Maybe he saw in Servius a kindred spirit, another talented outsider who'd been underestimated by birth. Or maybe, and this is where it gets dark, Lucius recognized that his own biological sons weren't up to the task of ruling, and Servius was. Whatever the reason, Servius became Lucius's right-hand man, his most trusted advisor, his heir apparent. And this, predictably, made some people very unhappy.
Remember Ancus Marcius's sons, the ones Lucius was supposed to be guarding when he decided to crown himself king instead? They were still around, still angry, still waiting for their moment. They'd watched Lucius rule for decades now, watched him succeed, watched Rome prosper, and it must have eaten them alive. This foreigner was king. This immigrant was transforming their city. And they, the rightful heirs of Ancus Marcius, were just nobles. Important, sure, wealthy, but not royal. They'd been patient, waiting, maybe hoping Lucius would screw up, give them an opening. He never did. So they decided to make their own opening.
One day, we don't know the exact year, but Lucius had been king for nearly 40 years by this point. The sons of Ancus Marcius arranged for 2 shepherds to come to the palace. The shepherds supposedly had a dispute that required the king's judgment. A common enough occurrence. Kings were expected to settle disputes, especially among the lower classes who couldn't afford fancy lawyers. Lucius agreed to see them. The shepherds approached. They presented their case. Lucius listened. Probably tired, maybe distracted. He was an old man now. He'd spent 4 decades building, fighting, governing. He'd earned some weariness. One of the shepherds suddenly pulled an axe. The other grabbed Lucius, and before anyone could react, they killed him, right there in the palace. The king of Rome, the man who talked his way from Etruscan obscurity to absolute power, murdered by 2 random shepherds who were absolutely not random shepherds. It was an assassination, crude, brutal, effective. The shepherds were, of course, agents of Ancus Marcius's sons, hired killers. The sons themselves maintained plausible deniability. They were nowhere near the palace when it happened. Just 2 nobles going about their business while, oh dear, what a tragedy, the king has been murdered. The killers tried to run. They didn't make it far. Palace guards caught them, killed them, but the damage was done. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the immigrant king, the self-made monarch, was dead, and Rome exploded into chaos. Okay, so your husband, the king, has just been murdered in his own palace by assassins working for bitter princes who think the throne should have been theirs 40 years ago. The royal court is in shock. Guards are running around trying to figure out what just happened. The assassins are dead, but their employers are still out there, and they probably have more plans. What do you do? If you're Tanaquil, you lie magnificently. Tanaquil heard the commotion, rushed to where her husband had fallen, saw him dead or dying. Sources vary on whether he died instantly or lingered for a bit, but either way, he wasn't going to recover. An axe to the head tends to be fairly definitive. And Tanaquil, this woman who'd read an eagle's flight and predicted her husband would be king, who'd guided his rise through sheer force of will and political genius, looked at this disaster and thought, I can work with this. She ordered the palace sealed, no one in or out. She sent servants to announce that the king had been attacked but was recovering. Wounded, yes, but he would be fine. He just needed rest. He'd address the people soon. Meanwhile, inside the palace, Tanaquil found Servius Tullius, her son-in-law, Lucius's chosen heir, and basically told him, your father-in-law is dead. The princes who killed him are going to try to seize power, and you have about 6 hours to become king before this whole thing falls apart. Servius, to his credit, didn't panic. He dressed in royal regalia. He appeared at the palace windows, visible to the crowds gathering outside.
He announced that the king was injured but recovering, and that he, Servius, would be acting as regent in the meantime, carrying out the king's duties until Lucius could resume his throne. The crowd accepted this. Why wouldn't they? Servius was the king's son-in-law. He'd been Lucius's right hand for years. Of course he'd step in temporarily during a crisis. Days passed. Servius governed, made decisions, presented himself as calm, capable, in control, all while telling everyone that Lucius was recovering nicely. Thank you for asking. Should be back on his feet any day now. And then, when enough time had passed, when Servius had consolidated his position and secured the support of key senators and military commanders, Tanaquil finally announced the truth. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was dead. But by then, it didn't matter, because Servius was already acting as king. He'd already been governing successfully. The transition of power had already happened. They were just now making it official. The Roman people, the Senate, they went along with it, partly because they liked Servius, partly because the alternative was civil war and instability, and partly because Tanaquil, the queen, the woman who'd engineered one kingship already, had outmaneuvered everyone.
The sons of Ancus Marcius must have been livid. They'd finally worked up the courage to kill Lucius, and it accomplished nothing. They'd murdered the king, and the kingdom had simply moved on without them. They'd tried to protest, tried to claim that Servius had no right to the throne, that he wasn't even Roman-born, that he was the son of a slave, for crying out loud. Nobody cared. Servius became king. And here's the darkly funny part. Servius Tullius would go on to be one of Rome's greatest kings. He'd rule for over 40 years. He'd implement constitutional reforms, expand the city, continue Lucius's building projects. He'd be beloved, successful, remembered as a truly legitimate monarch. So Lucius's legacy didn't die with him. It carried on through Servius. The dynasty continued. The immigrant king's transformation of Rome kept going. But that's not where this story ends, because Servius had daughters too, and one of them was named Tullia. And Tullia made her father's generation look tame by comparison. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let's just sit for a moment with how Lucius's reign ended, because there's something almost tragic about it, isn't there? This man spent his entire life fighting against the idea that birth determines worth. He proved that talent, ambition, intelligence, these things mattered more than bloodlines. He transformed Rome from a village into a proper city. He gave 40 years of his life to a kingdom that hadn't even been his by birth. And in the end, he was killed by men who believed that bloodlines did matter, that they deserved the throne simply because of who their father had been. Men who couldn't accept that someone like Lucius, a nobody, a foreigner, an immigrant, could be king. The irony would be poetic if it wasn't so violent. But here's the thing. Ancus Marcius's sons failed anyway. They killed the king, but they didn't win. They got their revenge, but they didn't get the throne. History barely remembers their names, while Lucius Tarquinius Priscus is remembered as one of the founding fathers of Rome, one of the kings who took a settlement of shepherds and turned it into something that would eventually conquer the known world. Not bad for an immigrant who was told he'd never amount to anything. So let's talk about what happens after you successfully pull off one of history's greatest social climbs. You've died tragically, violently, but your chosen heir has taken the throne. Your building projects continue. Your dynasty survives. By most measures, you've won. Except here's the uncomfortable question.
what exactly did you win? Lucius Tarquinius Priscus didn't just change his own fate, he changed Rome's trajectory, and not all of those changes were great. See, before Lucius, Rome's kings had been, more or less, first among equals. They were powerful, sure, but they ruled with the consent of the Senate, the approval of the people. There was a republican spirit to early Rome, this sense that power should be shared, that no one man should have absolute authority. Lucius changed that calculus. He showed that with enough wealth, enough charisma, enough political maneuvering, you could accumulate serious personal power. You could override traditions. You could elevate your chosen successors regardless of established customs. He was brilliant, yes, and he used that power to build aqueducts and sewers and forums. But he'd also demonstrated a template for autocracy that his successors would follow and pervert. Servius Tullius, his son-in-law, was cut from the same cloth as Lucius, capable, visionary, genuinely interested in Rome's welfare. Servius instituted constitutional reforms that distributed power more fairly among the classes. He was a good king. But Servius had daughters, and one of those daughters, Tullia, married a man named Lucius Tarquinius. Not Priscus, that was grandpa. This was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. And Superbus was, well, he was everything dark and terrible about ambition without conscience. According to legend, Tullia convinced her husband to murder her father. Yes, you read that right. She urged Superbus to kill King Servius and seize the throne, and Superbus did. He had Servius thrown down the steps of the Senate. The old king, broken and bleeding, tried to crawl away. Tullia herself supposedly drove her chariot over her father's body, crushing him in the street. True? Maybe not literally, but metaphorically, absolutely. Superbus became king through violence and stayed king through terror. He ruled as a tyrant in the truest sense. Absolute power, no checks, no balances, just his will enforced by threats and executions. He was everything Lucius and Servius had not been. And the Roman people, who had accepted Lucius because he'd earned their respect, who had accepted Servius because he'd proven capable, could not stomach Superbus. In 509 BCE, the Romans revolted. They overthrew Superbus, drove him out of the city, and they made a collective decision: never again.
Never again would Rome have a king. Never again would they allow one man to accumulate that much power. The word king, rex, became so hated in Rome that it remained a curse word for centuries. The Romans would rather die than live under a rex. Instead, they created a republic, a system of consuls, senators, checks and balances, a government where power was distributed, limited, constantly contested. And that republic, born from the Romans' hatred of their last king, would go on to conquer the Mediterranean world. So, here's the question. Is Lucius Tarquinius Priscus responsible for that? Did his successful power grab create the conditions for tyranny? Did he break the old traditions so thoroughly that it became possible for men like Superbus to abuse the system? Or did he just reveal human nature, that given the opportunity, people will always reach for power, and societies need to actively prevent consolidation of authority? Maybe it's both. Maybe Lucius was a product of his time, a brilliant man who saw an opportunity and seized it, not
thinking about what doors he was opening for less principled successors. Or maybe I'm overthinking this. Maybe the lesson is simpler. Ambition is a tool. It can build sewers and forums, or it can justify murder and tyranny. It depends entirely on the person wielding it. Lucius built, Superbus destroyed. Both were ambitious, both were Tarquins, but only one is remembered with respect. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not the buildings or the bloodlines, but the reminder that how you use power matters infinitely more than how you get it. Though, let's be honest, the Cloaca Maxima is a pretty solid legacy too. 2,600 years, still functional. Not many of us can say our work will outlast us by quite that margin. Sweet dreams.
Quick question before we drift further into history. When was the last time you heard about a powerful woman in ancient times who didn't get labeled a witch, a seductress, or a manipulative schemer by the men writing the history books? Yeah, me neither. So when we talk about Tanaquil, we need to be careful, because the sources we have, mostly Livy writing centuries after the fact, paint her in that classic ancient historian way, mysterious, possibly magical, definitely too smart for her own good, the kind of woman who made men nervous. But let's look at what she actually did, stripped of the melodrama. Tanaquil was born into Etruscan nobility. She received the kind of education that aristocratic women in Etruria got, which, interestingly, was considerably more extensive than what Roman women typically received. The Etruscans were weird like that. They let women attend banquets with men, let them own property, participate in public life. The Romans found this scandalous. The Greeks found it absolutely appalling. Tanaquil learned divination, not as some mystical parlor trick, but as a legitimate science in Etruscan culture. Reading omens was how you understood the will of the gods, how you made major decisions, how you navigated uncertainty. It was astronomy meets meteorology meets psychology, all wrapped in religious ritual. She also learned politics, how power actually worked, who held it, who wanted it, how it transferred, what it cost. And when she married Lucomo, this wealthy but ultimately powerless young man stuck in a society that would never accept him, she saw potential that nobody else did. Think about that for a second. She was high-born Etruscan nobility. She could have married anyone, some minor prince maybe, or a powerful merchant family's heir. She chose the refugee's son, the outsider. Why? Maybe love. Ancient sources occasionally hint at genuine affection between them. But also, maybe she recognized something, that Lucomo had the raw materials for greatness but lacked direction, that his very outsider status could be an asset in the right environment. Rome was that environment. So when she convinced him to leave Etruria, she wasn't running away from failure. She was executing a plan. She'd identified a market inefficiency, if we want to think of it in modern terms. Rome needed sophisticated, educated, wealthy elites, and Lucomo needed a place where those qualities mattered more than ancestry. The eagle omen? Maybe it was real. Maybe Tanaquil saw an eagle behave unusually and interpreted it according to her training. Maybe she saw a bird do something mundane and spun it into a prophecy to give her husband confidence. Either way, she understood something crucial. Lucomo needed to believe he was destined for greatness, and once he believed it, he could make others believe it too. For the next 40 years, Tanaquil was the silent partner in Rome's transformation.
She never held official power. Women couldn't in Rome, but she advised, she networked, she managed the household that was effectively the center of Roman political life. She raised children and stepchildren. She identified Servius Tullius as someone worth cultivating when everyone else saw him as just the son of a slave. And when Lucumo was murdered, when everything threatened to collapse into chaos, Tanaquil didn't grieve first, she governed. That moment, ordering the palace sealed, lying about the king's condition, giving Servius time to consolidate power, that's not the act of a hysterical widow. That's crisis management at its finest. She bought time, she controlled the narrative, she prevented a civil war. The ancient sources call her cunning, scheming, manipulative. Modern word for that, competent. Tanaquil probably died sometime during Servius's reign, though the sources don't bother to record when. Women's deaths rarely warranted detail unless they were particularly dramatic. She just fades from the record, her work done, her dynasty secure. But here's what's wild. Without Tanaquil, there probably is no King Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. Without her pushing him to leave Etruria, without her reading that omen and convincing him he was destined for greatness, without her political acumen guiding his rise, Lucumo probably dies a wealthy nobody in Tarquini. She made a king, and then, after he died, she made another one. Not bad for someone history barely remembers.
All right, so here's where we get into the weeds a bit. Because if you're going to understand why Lucius Tarquinius Priscus actually mattered, why he's not just a footnote, but a genuine historical figure, you need to understand what he built, literally. Ancient kingship was weird. You'd think being king meant you could just coast, live in luxury, let everyone else do the work. But actually, kings needed to constantly justify their existence. You had to give people reasons to follow you. And in the ancient world, that usually meant two things: military victories and construction projects. Lucius delivered on both, but let's focus on the construction, because that's what actually lasted. The Circus Maximus. We've mentioned it, but let's really think about what it meant. Before Lucius, chariot racing happened somewhere, probably just on flat ground outside the city. No formal track, no seating, just people and horses and a lot of dust. Lucius looked at that valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills and saw possibility. The land was perfect, a natural depression that could hold crowds, with hillsides that could serve as seating. He formalized it, created actual designated racing lanes, built preliminary seating structures, organized official races with rules and prizes. Why did this matter? Because it gave Romans a shared cultural experience. Rich and poor, patrician and plebeian, everyone could come to the circus and watch the races together. It was entertainment, yes, but it was also social engineering, creating a space where Roman identity could form across class lines. The Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, sounds less glamorous until you realize what it actually accomplished. Rome was built on 7 hills with valleys between them. Those valleys collected water. They got marshy, swampy, breeding grounds for mosquitoes and disease. Large sections of what would become central Rome were basically uninhabitable. Lucius's sewer system drained those valleys, made the land usable, created space for expansion. And it did this with engineering that was sophisticated enough to last millennia. We're talking about a complex network of channels, tunnels, and drainage systems that required understanding hydraulics, surveying, materials science. This wasn't just digging a ditch.
This was civil engineering at a level that suggests Lucius either had access to serious Etruscan expertise or himself was considerably more knowledgeable than the typical ancient monarch. The Forum Romanum. This one's harder to visualize because the Forum changed so much over the centuries, but Lucius's contribution was foundational. He took this marshy valley that occasionally served as a market and transformed it into the Forum, paved, drained, organized. He built temples there, market buildings, public gathering spaces. He created Rome's downtown, the place where civic life would happen for the next 1,000 years. Every important trial, every major political debate, every celebration and funeral, they'd all happen in the space Lucius first organized. He also built temples, a temple to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, though sources argue about whether he just started it and Tarquinius Superbus finished it, a temple to Diana on the Aventine Hill. These weren't just religious buildings, they were political statements, architectural power plays. Temples in the ancient world were banks, museums, political clubhouses, and religious centers, all ruled into one. By building temples, Lucius was creating infrastructure for Roman civic religion, establishing Rome as a city that honored the gods properly, attracting divine favor.
Here's a thing that ancient Roman historians loved to ignore. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was not technically Roman. He was Etruscan. And this mattered a lot more than Rome's later historians wanted to admit. The Etruscans, for those who've dozed off during that part of history class, were the dominant culture in central Italy before Rome rose to power. They were sophisticated, wealthy, artistic. They built cities with proper urban planning. They had writing. They traded with Greeks and Phoenicians. They were, by most measures, more civilized than the early Romans. They also had this unsettling habit, to Greek and Roman writers anyway, of treating women like actual people with agency and opinions. Etruscan women attended banquets, owned property, had their own names that weren't just daughter of or wife of. They could inherit. They participated in public religious ceremonies. There are Etruscan tomb paintings showing couples reclining together at feasts, the women just as prominent as the men. Romans found this morally suspect. They told stories about Etruscan women being promiscuous, shameless, improper. But really, Etruscan women just had rights that Roman women didn't. So when Lucumo and Tanaquil showed up in Rome, they brought Etruscan culture with them. Etruscan religious practices, Etruscan artistic sensibilities, Etruscan engineering knowledge, and possibly, though Roman sources would never admit this, some Etruscan ideas about governance. The engineering especially, those sewers, that urban planning, that's Etruscan expertise. The Romans hadn't developed that level of civil engineering yet. Lucius either imported Etruscan engineers or applied knowledge he'd gained growing up in Tarquini. Same with divination. The Romans practiced augury, reading bird flight and other omens, but they learned it from the Etruscans. Tanaquil reading that eagle's behavior, that's Etruscan knowledge. Later, Roman magistrates would regularly consult Etruscan diviners on important matters. They didn't like to advertise this dependency, but it existed. There's also a possibility that some of Rome's political institutions have Etruscan roots. The Senate, the concept of elected magistrates, the idea of term limits. We tend to think of these as purely Roman innovations, but Etruscan cities had councils, elected officials, complex governmental structures. Lucius might have imported or adapted some of these ideas. Roman historians, writing centuries later when Rome had conquered and largely erased Etruscan civilization, downplayed all of this. They wanted Rome's greatness to be homegrown, indigenous, not borrowed from their former rivals. But the archaeological evidence suggests otherwise. Early Rome was deeply influenced by Etruscan culture, and Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was the main vector for that influence. Here's what's even more interesting. The later Romans were deeply ambivalent about their Etruscan kings. On one hand, they acknowledged that Lucius and Servius Tullius had been good rulers who'd built important things. On the other hand, they were foreigners, outsiders, not real Romans.
And then there was Tarquinius Superbus, the last king, whose tyranny gave Rome the excuse to reject kingship entirely. Superbus was Etruscan too, Lucius's grandson, so later Republican Romans could tell themselves a convenient story. Kingship was bad, and coincidentally, the worst kings had been Etruscan. Therefore, getting rid of kings and getting rid of Etruscan influence were the same heroic act. This is, of course, nonsense. Rome had plenty of non-Etruscan terrible leaders, and Etruscan civilization contributed enormously to Roman development. But it's easier to write a triumphalist national history if you can blame the foreigner for everything that went wrong. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus got caught in this historical revision. He's remembered, but ambivalently. Yes, he built important things. Yes, he expanded Rome's power. But he was also foreign, an immigrant, someone who didn't really belong but managed to take power anyway. Sound familiar? The anxiety about Lucius in Roman historical memory mirrors every society's anxiety about outsiders gaining power, the fear that immigrants will change the culture, that foreign influences will corrupt native traditions, that someone without the proper bloodline might not have the proper loyalty. And yet, Lucius spent 40 years proving those fears wrong. He was more devoted to Rome's success than most native-born Romans. He invested his fortune, his energy, his entire life into making Rome great. He died because of Roman political disputes, not because of any divided loyalty to Etruria. But none of that mattered to the later narrative. The story Rome told itself was about Roman exceptionalism. Foreign kings were a historical embarrassment to be minimized, not celebrated. Which is too bad, because the truth that Rome was built by a complex mixture of Latin, Sabine, Etruscan, and Greek influences, that its greatest early kings were immigrants, that its culture was syncretic and adaptive rather than purely homegrown, that's actually a more interesting and impressive story. Rome succeeded because it absorbed the best of what it encountered. It took Etruscan engineering and made it Roman. It took Greek philosophy and made it Roman. It took gods from everywhere and made them Roman. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was the first major example of that pattern, the immigrant who became more Roman than the Romans, who gave more to his adopted country than most of its native sons, and then got murdered by people who could never accept that a foreigner belonged on the throne. History is ironic like that.
So here's a fun thing about ancient history. We remember the buildings, We remember the dramatic assassinations. We remember the romantic stories about eagles and prophecies. We do not remember the wars. Which is weird, because Lucius Tarquinius Priscus spent a significant portion of his 40-year reign fighting wars, lots of them, against the Latins, the Sabines, various Etruscan cities, probably others we've forgotten about entirely. Why don't we remember these wars? Partly because they were small scale by later standards. We're not talking about massive armies clashing on epic battlefields. We're talking about a few hundred, maybe a few thousand warriors fighting over territory, resources, prestige. Raids and counter-raids, sieges of small fortified towns, border skirmishes. But also, we don't remember because ancient historians didn't find them particularly interesting. Livy, our main source, mentions them almost in passing. Oh, and then Lucius fought the Latins and won. Moving on. But these wars mattered enormously. They established Rome's military reputation. They brought in wealth, spoils, slaves, tribute that funded Lucius's building projects. They expanded Roman territory and influence. They turned Rome from a single city into the dominant power in Latium. Let's talk about the Latin Wars first. The Latins were Rome's neighbors, literally the people living in Latium, the region around Rome. They spoke the same language, worshipped similar gods, had comparable cultures. They were essentially Rome's cousins. And like all cousins, they fought constantly over who was in charge. Before Lucius, Rome was one Latin city among many. Important, maybe, but not dominant. The Latins had a league, basically a religious and political alliance of Latin cities. Rome participated, but it didn't lead. Lucius changed that. He went to war against specific Latin cities that challenged Roman interests. He besieged them, conquered them, imposed terms, and critically, he did this while claiming he was acting on behalf of the Latin League, not against it. This was politically brilliant. He wasn't trying to destroy Latin unity. He was trying to make Rome the head of that unity, to position Rome as first among equals, the city that should naturally lead because it was the strongest, wealthiest, best organized. It worked. By the end of his reign, Rome was the dominant Latin city, not the only Latin city, but the one that others looked to for leadership. The Sabines were different. The Sabines lived northeast of Rome, in the hills. They were tougher, more rural, less urbanized than the Latins. According to Roman legend, Rome had a complicated history with the Sabines. There was that whole rape of the Sabine women thing, where early Romans had supposedly kidnapped Sabine women to get wives. True or not, relations were tense. The Sabines raided Roman territory. Romans raided back. It was a constant low-level conflict. Lucius fought multiple campaigns against them. Not to conquer Sabine territory, the hills weren't that valuable, and holding them would have been expensive, but to push the Sabines back, establish buffer zones, make raiding Roman lands too costly and dangerous to be worth it. He succeeded. The Sabines remained independent, but they learned to respect Roman power, which was the goal. Lucius wasn't trying to build an empire in the imperial sense. He was trying to establish Rome as the regional power that nobody wanted to mess with. There were also wars against Etruscan cities. This is particularly interesting because Lucius was Etruscan. You'd think maybe he'd have special relationships with his homeland cities, right? Maybe diplomatic advantages? Nope. Etruria wasn't a unified nation.
It was a collection of independent city-states that cooperated sometimes and fought each other constantly. Lucius, having been rejected by Tarquini,
So why don't we remember these wars? Because individually, none of them were that significant. They were workmanlike, competent, successful enough, but not legendary. Lucius wasn't Alexander the Great. He didn't conquer vast territories or defeat enormous armies. He was just good at the grinding work of establishing regional dominance. Fight a war, win, negotiate a favorable peace, wait a few years, fight another war when someone else challenged Roman interests, repeat. It's not glamorous, but it's what actual leadership often looks like. Not dramatic gestures, but consistent, competent execution over decades. By the time Lucius died, Rome controlled or dominated a significant swath of central Italy. It was the power in Latium. It had pushed back the Sabines. It commanded respect even from Etruscan cities. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because for 40 years, Lucius fought wars, negotiated treaties, demonstrated strength, and built the military apparatus that future Romans would inherit and expand. The forgotten wars of a remembered king. Okay, real talk for a minute. We need to address something. How much of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus's story is actually true? Because here's the uncomfortable reality of ancient history. Most of what we think we know about early Rome comes from historians writing hundreds of years after the events. Livy, our main source, was writing around 27 BCE, over 500 years after Lucius supposedly died. Imagine someone today writing a detailed biography of a person who lived in the 1500s, using only oral traditions and no contemporary records. How accurate would that be? That's essentially what we're dealing with. We know Rome had kings. That's pretty solid. Archaeological evidence, later Republican traditions, multiple independent sources, they all confirm Rome's early monarchy. We know one of these kings was named Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. His name appears in king lists that were maintained fairly consistently. The Romans themselves believed he existed and had a pretty clear idea of when he reigned. We know he was associated with major building projects, the Circus Maximus, the Cloaca Maxima, the early Forum. These are real things that were built, and Roman tradition attributed them to Lucius. Whether he personally built them or just gets credit for construction that happened during his era, we can't be certain, but there's a connection there. We know he was Etruscan or of Etruscan origin. This was too embarrassing for later Romans to make up. If they were inventing a glorious past, they wouldn't have made one of their early kings foreign. The fact that they acknowledged his Etruscan background suggests it was true. Beyond that, things get fuzzy. The eagle omen? Maybe, maybe not. It's the kind of legendary detail that gets added to legitimize a ruler. Every ancient king has some miraculous sign from the gods justifying their rule. It might be based on something real that got embellished over centuries of retelling. The assassination by sons of Ancus Marcius? The core fact that Lucius was murdered is probably true. The details? Who knows? Ancient historians loved good stories. They'd take a simple fact, like the king was murdered, and construct an entire dramatic narrative around it, complete with motivations, dialogue, and moral lessons. Tanaquil hiding his death and orchestrating Servius's succession? Again, something probably happened. There was a succession from Lucius to Servius that didn't follow typical patterns. Whether it played out exactly as described, with Tanaquil masterfully managing the situation, or whether it was messier and got cleaned up in the retelling, we can't say. The specific wars, the treaties, the political maneuvers, most of this is lost. We get general impressions.
Rome expanded under Lucius. He fought neighbors. He built things. He was successful. But the details, the day-to-day decisions, the personal relationships, the internal palace politics, we're mostly guessing based on what made sense to historians writing centuries later. And here's the really tricky part. Those later historians had agendas. They were writing during the late Republic or early Empire. They wanted to tell stories that taught lessons about Roman virtue, about the dangers of kingship, about why the Republic was better. So they shaped early Roman history to serve those narratives. Lucius got to be a good king to contrast with Tarquinius Superbus, the bad king. His story became a morality tale about ambition that serves the state versus ambition that serves only itself. How much of the real Lucius Tarquinius Priscus survived this reshaping? Hard to say. But here's what's fascinating. Even accounting for all the legendary embellishment, even if half the stories are made up or exaggerated, there's still something real underneath. Some actual person did rise from Etruscan origins to become king of Rome. Some actual king did oversee major infrastructure projects that transformed the city. Some actual succession crisis did occur after his death, resulting in Servius Tullius taking power. The bones of the story are solid. It's just the flesh we're uncertain about. And maybe that's okay. Maybe what matters isn't whether Tanaquil literally threw her arms around Lucumo's neck and told him he'd be king. Maybe what matters is that Roman tradition remembered a foreign couple coming to Rome and succeeding beyond anyone's expectations through intelligence and determination. Maybe what matters isn't whether Lucius personally designed the Cloaca Maxima. Maybe what matters is that Rome's transformation from village to city happened during his reign, under his leadership, making him responsible in the way that leaders are responsible for what happens on their watch. We're never going to have perfect historical clarity about Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. Too much time has passed. Too many records were lost or never existed. Too many storytellers reshaped the narrative for their own purposes. But we have enough to know that something remarkable happened in Rome in the 6th and 7th centuries BCE. Enough to know that a man named Lucius, probably from Etruria, became king of Rome and changed Rome forever. Enough to see the outline of an immigrant success story that resonated so powerfully it survived half a millennium of oral tradition before being written down. That's not nothing.
So here's the thing about Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. His story doesn't really end when he dies. Most historical figures, when they die, that's it. Their influence fades, maybe they're remembered fondly or studied by historians, but their active impact on events stops. Not Lucius. His dynasty continued through Servius Tullius. His infrastructure kept shaping Roman life for centuries. His example, that an outsider could become king through merit rather than birth, became part of Rome's founding mythology. Even Tarquinius Superbus, the terrible tyrant grandson, was part of Lucius's legacy. Superbus used the same ruthless ambition Lucius had demonstrated, but without the public service or political wisdom. He showed what happens when you take Lucius's methods and strip away the conscience. And when the Romans overthrew Superbus and established the Republic, they were in part reacting to what Lucius had started. The concentration of power in a capable king's hands, the breaking of traditional limitations, the idea that personal ambition could override constitutional norms. The Republic was designed to prevent another Lucius, or more accurately, to prevent another Superbus. But Superbus was only possible because Lucius had shown that the traditional limits on royal power were flexible. So, in a way, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus's ultimate legacy was the Roman Republic itself. Not because he intended it, not because he wanted to abolish monarchy, but because his successful power grab demonstrated that Rome needed stronger institutional checks against ambitious individuals. The sewers he built still carry water. The forum he organized is still Rome's symbolic center. The Circus Maximus site still exists. But his real lasting impact was more abstract. He proved that Rome could be ruled by talent rather than just birth, that outsiders could become insiders, that the city was adaptable, could absorb foreign influences and emerge stronger. These ideas would define Rome for the next 1,000 years. The Republic would promote talented men from nowhere to positions of supreme power. The empire would have emperors from Spain, from Gaul, from North Africa. Rome would constantly absorb foreign peoples and foreign ideas, making them Roman. Lucius was the prototype for all of that. He showed it could work, that bringing in the best from everywhere, regardless of origin, made you stronger rather than weaker. And yeah, he also showed the dangers, that ambitious outsiders might not respect your traditions, that they might change things in ways you're not comfortable with, that letting someone accumulate too much power based on competence and charisma might lead to tyranny. Rome learned both lessons. They created a system that could promote talented outsiders while limiting how much power any one person could hold. It wasn't perfect. The Republic eventually failed. The empire eventually fell. But it lasted a remarkably long time for a state built on those contradictions. All of that traces back, in some way, to a wealthy Etruscan nobody who showed up at Rome's gates with a pregnant wife, a fortune in gold, and a story about an eagle that supposedly meant he was destined for greatness. He believed the story. He made others believe it, and through sheer force of will, competence, and political genius, he turned belief into reality. That's the real story of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, not the buildings or the battles or the backstabbing, but the demonstration that you could write your own destiny if you were smart enough, determined enough, and lucky enough to find a place that would let you try. Rome was that place, for Lucius, for countless others after him. And all of those countless others, all of those ambitious men and women who came to Rome from elsewhere and made it their own, they were walking the path that Lucius first carved. Not bad for an immigrant who wasn't supposed to amount to anything.
So it's late. You're tired. Maybe you've dozed off a few times during this story. That's fine. That's the point. But before you fully drift away, here's what you should remember about Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. He was nobody, born to the wrong father, in the wrong place, denied the respect and opportunities his wealth and education should have earned him. He refused to accept that, picked up everything, moved to a foreign city, started over. He worked the system, made friends, made himself valuable, turned his outsider status into an asset rather than a liability. He became king, not through war or treachery, but through politics and persuasion. He convinced people to give him power. He earned it, built sewers and forums, won wars, expanded Rome's territory and influence, made himself so obviously the right choice that nobody could seriously question his legitimacy. Until they did. Until bitter men with long memories and sharp axes decided that no foreigner should be king, no matter what he'd accomplished. He died violently, but his work continued, his dynasty continued, his example continued. And centuries later, when historians tried to understand how Rome became Rome, they look back at this immigrant king and see one of the crucial turning points, one of the moments when Rome could have stayed small and insular and traditional, but instead chose to open its doors to talent from anywhere. That choice, more than any sewer or forum or temple, is what made Rome Rome. And it started with a guy named Lucomo who had a wife smart enough to read omens and a belief that he deserved better than what Etruria offered. Sometimes that's all it takes. A little ambition, a lot of competence, the willingness to start over somewhere new, and maybe, if you're very lucky, an eagle at just the right moment. Sweet dreams.
The Circus Maximus still stands in Rome. Well, the valley does. The ancient structure is mostly gone, but the space remains. 250,000 Romans once screamed themselves hoarse watching chariot races there. The Cloaca Maxima still functions, 2,600 years old, still carrying water to the Tiber. The Forum Romanum is ruins now, beautiful ruins. Tourists walk through it every day, taking pictures, trying to imagine the trials and speeches and celebrations that happened there. And somewhere in all of that stone and history, there's the echo of a man who started with nothing but money and ambition and ended up building the foundation of an empire. Not bad for a day's work. Now sleep. We'll see you next time for another story about somebody who probably shouldn't have succeeded, but did anyway. That's history. People doing impossible things, and then centuries later, we tell stories about them while you drift off to sleep. Good night.